Good morning. We are really glad to have you here, for those of you who are here on site and for those who are here online. And really, no matter where you are, online or on site, we want you to be part of this exciting vision of learning to live a life of love. To help you do that, we continue to curate and archive resources that you can make use of during the week. Just a reminder, our entire services can be found on our Facebook page. You can share them, you can re-watch them, re-experience them with others. Sermon content is also found on our website, along with our class content, notes, and videos. And you'll also find Embrace, which is our weekly communication tool, archived on that website. We do invite you to consider being a financial partner with us. Your gifts help sustain the great ministry that's taking place here. There are a number of ways that you can do that. They're listed here on the screen before you. And Julia did a great job of letting you know about what's coming up in the next few weeks here. New series starting up. And we want you, whether you're on site or part of our online community, we want you to join us for these new series, and we hope that you will. Kendra and I will sometimes watch one of those shows where a wildly talented couple renovate an old home. And they will take it from something that looks like it should be condemned and torn down and transform it into something that looks like it belongs on the glossy color pages of some home and living magazine. Inevitably, as the renovation gets underway, the couple finds something that they didn't expect to find. And sometimes it's something bad, like finding out that the foundation is cracked or the floor joists are rotted through. And sometimes it's really good, like ripping up the linoleum and finding beautiful hardwood floors underneath. But inevitable, there is more than meets the eye when the renovation takes place. And Daniel chapters 10 through 12 provide us an opportunity to think the same thing when it comes to our lives. There is more than meets the eye. This closing section of Daniel begins with Daniel mourning. Daniel chapter 10, verse 2, "In those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks," which sounds like pandemic life for many of us. But this mourning for Daniel is taking place shortly after some of the people who've been in exile have been sent back to Judah, sent back to Jerusalem. And we know from other books in the Old Testament that what they find in Judah and Jerusalem is a city and a land that's in a state of disrepair. And it may be that Daniel is mourning that his homeland, his hometown is in a state of disrepair. It may be that Daniel is mourning the fact that he and countless others remain in exile. We're told at the beginning of the book that Daniel is a young man when he's forced into exile. It's some 70 years later, and Daniel and many others continue to find themselves living in this space they never intended to be in. And it may be that Daniel is mourning that as well. But let's note here just for a moment that Daniel is mourning. And note the significance of that. That in the Bible, grief and mourning are normal. Some of the most extraordinary people in the Bible mourn and lament. Feeling sad, dealing with despair, expressing discouragement is not wrong. Sadness, depression, discouragement are not signs of a lack of faith. Last week I spoke with a young adult who had just been through a heart-wrenching breakup. And I simply said to him, it's okay to not be okay. In the Bible, grief, and mourning are normal. And so this morning, if you find yourself discouraged, if you find yourself hurting, if you find yourself in a bad place, please give yourself permission to do what Daniel does: mourn. Now, Daniel has been praying as he has been mourning. We know this because the divine figure who appears before Daniel tells him that he has come because of Daniel's words, presumably his prayers. In Daniel 10, verse 12, then he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you have set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words." As he's been mourning, Daniel has been praying. And in response to his prayers, this divine messenger comes. And what this divine messenger reveals to Daniel may be very surprising, because it is far outside our ordinary way of thinking. This divine messenger reveals that there is much more to life than meets the eye. Listen to these series of words in Daniel chapter 10, verses 13 through 14. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. For I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is 4 days yet to come. Verses 20 and 21. Then he said, "Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince." And Daniel 12, verse 12. "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book." God invites Daniel and us closer in, so that we might view a spiritual reality that we haven't seen behind the earthly reality that we do see. I began this series using two words, enchanted and disenchanted. And I said that disenchanted is often used to describe spaces and experiences where it feels like God is nowhere to be found, where nothing supernatural or heavenly seems to be taking place. And Daniel is experiencing a disenchanted space right now. Yes, there have been visions and dreams, as we have seen. Yes, there have been moments of delivery where Daniel was rescued from this den of lions. But for the most part, most of the time, this is a disenchanted space where it's difficult to know what God is up to. It's difficult to see anything supernatural or divine taking place. But here, in these closing moments, God invites Daniel closer in. He lifts the veil, and he reveals to Daniel a spiritual reality behind the earthly reality. Notice some of the things that we see. We see the angel Michael, the same angel that shows up in the book of Revelation fighting Satan. Michael is described as the chief prince, the great prince who has charge of your people. Earlier in the book, we're told of the angel Gabriel, back in Daniel chapter 9, the same angel who announces the birth of Jesus. We're told of the prince of the kingdom of Persia, who delays the divine figure who is speaking to Daniel, and against whom the angel Michael is fighting. We're also told of the prince of Greece in verse 20. What we find in these verses is something that most of us may have never even considered. There is a spiritual reality behind the earthly reality that we see. as Daniel is mourning and praying and grieving, there is a supernatural battle taking place in unseen realms. The angel Michael, the angel Gabriel are involved in this, and there are these darker demonic powers over Persia, over Greece, who are also involved in this. What we're seeing here is what Paul writes about later in Ephesians chapter 6, when he says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." God is inviting Daniel and us to look closer in and to see that there is a spiritual reality that we've not seen behind the earthly reality that we do see. Angels and powers with charge over the people of God and the nations of the earth. And this does at least a couple of things for us. First, it allows us to love people whom we might be tempted to hate. Author Richard Beck writes about this. He says that when we do what Daniel is doing here, when we look out in the world and we see things that disturb us, we see evil and injustice taking place, and we mourn over it, and we pray about it, we might be tempted to hate the people who seem to be behind it. Because in our limited perspective, those people are the only ones who have any responsibility for the evil and injustice taking place in the world. And what Daniel does is pulls us closer in, lifts the veil, so that we might see that there are also spiritual forces behind the evil and injustice that we see. Now, that doesn't absolve any human of their responsibility for that evil, but it does broaden our perspective and allows us to see that there are other forces at play. And ultimately, Beck says, what it does is it frees us from hating the people who are involved. It frees us to be able to love even those people who are involved, to love even our enemy, as Jesus teaches us to do, and then to redirect our righteous anger at a more appropriate object, these spiritual forces of evil at work in unseen ways in the world. Another thing that this closer in perspective does for us is that it allows us to believe in a God whom we may be tempted to doubt. There are many times when we might look at a situation and it seems as if God is nowhere to be found. God is doing absolutely nothing about this situation. And what the book of Daniel does is it invites us closer in and invites us to believe that there's a lot more going on than we might see. To believe that there is a God engaged in warfare on our behalf. When we look at some of the harshest realities in our world today, the unfathomable deaths taking place in India from COVID, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, we're called to consider that there is a lot more going on than meets the eye. There is a God at work. There's a God fighting on behalf of humanity. There's a God laboring to bring an end to all evil in the world. And so while we might have been tempted to doubt God, as we see this closer in reality, we're now able to believe in God. One of the great blessings that I get to experience each week is spending about an hour online with a group of young adults. Many of them are members of the LGBTQ plus community. Many of them are allies of that community. I also spend about an hour each week online with some parents of children who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. And while I'm sworn to confidentiality about what we talk about in those meetings and what's shared in those meetings, one of the things that I'm struck by every single week is the tremendous challenges facing both of those groups. Some have shared how they've been rejected by their own congregations. Some have shared how friends have been treating them like enemies. And discouragement and despair is a common part of our conversation. But so is faith and hope and love. And I'm repeatedly inspired, by the way, that so many in these gatherings are able to look behind what we see and still believe in a God who is for them and believe in a God who is fighting on their behalf. And that's one of the things that we find in the book of Daniel. Let me take just one moment more to touch on one final theme in these closing chapters in Daniel 10 through 12. In these final chapters, God not only invites us closer in, but he also invites us to look farther out. These closing chapters are a somewhat detailed picture of what's going to happen in Persia with the leaders who will be coming in successive years. They're also a broad picture of what's going to happen from the time of Daniel all the way until the very end of human history. And so these closing chapters end with this statement in Daniel 12, beginning in verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now there's a lot being said in this short paragraph. Once again, we have these spiritual forces. Michael, the angel, is mentioned here at the end of time. Trouble is again mentioned at the end of time. Even at the end of human history, there's still going to be trouble. But notice what else is mentioned here. The delivery of the people of God. All of those whose names are written in the book. And those who have died, those who sleep in the dust of the earth, come back to life. And the lives of the wise, the lives of the righteous, we're told, shine like stars in the night sky. God is inviting Daniel and us in these closing chapters to look farther out and to see the current moment in the context of the larger picture. God's inviting Daniel and us to see that our chapter is part of a much larger novel, and that this novel has a happy ending, even if we feel like our chapter doesn't. Now, this illustration is not new with me, but imagine if this was all that you see when you looked out onto your life. You saw a storm. You saw the strike of lightning. You felt the bluster of wind and the sound of thunder. And if that's all that you could see, it would lead to anxiety. It would lead to stress. It would lead to worry. But what if there was a way to look farther out? What if there was a way to extend the frame so that you could now see that storm in the context of a much greater picture? Well, that might allow you to manage the storm in a more healthy way. And that's what's going on here in the book of Daniel. God is helping Daniel and us to look farther out. Whatever you're facing this week, I invite you to look farther out. Look beyond tonight. Look beyond this week. Look beyond this year. Look years, decades, centuries into the future. Because what God is telling Daniel is that in the end, it will all work out. Julian of Norwich was deathly ill when Jesus appeared to her in a vision and gave her these words, "But all will be well, and all will be well, and every kind of thing will be well." Initially, as Julian received these words, she said they led to mourning. They were heavy words, because she wondered, how in the world could that be true when the world was filled with so much sorrow and suffering? And she writes in one of her books that for 15 years she wrestled with the truth of these words, but in the end she came to accept them. And that is the truth of the end of the book of Daniel. No matter what is happening in the present, as we look farther out, we can know without any doubt at all that all will be well. And all will be well. And every kind of thing will be well.